Sleep Tight. Disturbing Real Alien Stories. Part 1. Hello everyone and welcome back to Sleep Tight. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. I never thought I'd be the type of person to see something I couldn't explain. I'm a practical guy. Worked construction for 15 years. Keep my feet on the ground. But what happened to me 3 months ago changed everything I thought I knew about what's out there in the dark. It was a Tuesday night in October. I was driving home from my brother's place out in the country, taking the back roads like I always do. The highway adds 20 minutes to the trip, and I've driven those winding country roads so many times I could do it with my eyes closed. It was just past 11 when I saw the first light. At first, I thought it was a helicopter. There was this soft, pulsing glow hovering maybe 200 feet above the tree line. But helicopters make noise, and this thing was completely silent, dead silent, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I slowed down and pulled over to the shoulder. The light wasn't moving like aircraft move. It wasn't following any kind of path or pattern. It just hung there in the sky, pulsing with this pale blue radiance that seemed to breathe. Like it was alive. That's when I noticed my radio had gone to static, complete white noise. My phone showed no signal, even though I always get at least 2 bars on that stretch of road. The dashboard clock had stopped at 11:07. The digital numbers frozen like time itself had paused. I sat there for maybe 5 minutes, engine idling, watching this thing hover above the forest. Part of me wanted to drive away, pretend I'd never seen it. But I couldn't move. It was beautiful in a way that didn't make sense. Beautiful and terrifying at the same time. Then it started descending. Slowly, deliberately, like it was being lowered by invisible strings. As it came down through the tree line, I could make out its shape more clearly. It wasn't a disc or a triangle like you see in movies. It was more organic, almost teardrop-shaped, with a surface that seemed to shift and flow like liquid metal. The thing settled into the trees about a quarter mile from the road. The pulsing light dimmed, but didn't disappear completely. It cast these strange shadows through the forest, shadows that moved even though there was no wind. I don't know what possessed me to get out of the truck. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to drive away, but something stronger pulled me toward those trees. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was something else entirely. The air felt different as I walked into the forest, thicker somehow, like walking through water. The usual night sounds were gone, no crickets, no rustling leaves, no distant owl calls, just that heavy, pressing silence. I followed the glow deeper into the woods, pushing through branches that seemed to bend away from me. The light grew brighter with each step, but it wasn't harsh or blinding. It was soft, almost welcoming, like candlelight. When I finally reached the clearing, I stopped breathing. The craft was beautiful. That's the only word for it. It sat in the center of a perfect circle where all the grass had been pressed flat. The surface rippled with colors I don't have names for, colors that seemed to exist just at the edge of vision. And it was big. Maybe 40 feet across, 15 feet tall at its highest point. But it wasn't the craft that made me freeze. It was what stood beside it. The being was tall, maybe 7 feet, with limbs that were too long and joints that bent in ways that didn't quite make sense. Its skin had the same flowing quality as the craft's surface, like it was made of the same impossible material. It had no face that I could recognize, just a smooth oval where features should have been. We looked at each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. I wasn't afraid anymore. The fear had been replaced by something else. Recognition, maybe, like seeing an old friend after years apart. Then it spoke to me, not with words, but directly into my mind. Its voice was gentle, curious, tinged with something that might have been loneliness. "You are not what we expected," it said without speaking. I tried to respond but couldn't form thoughts into words. The being seemed to understand anyway. "Your species fascinates us. You create beauty and destroy it in the same breath. You reach for the stars while poisoning your own world. We have been watching, trying to understand." Images flooded my mind. Cities from above, oceans choked with plastic, forests burning, but also children laughing, couples dancing, artists painting, the full spectrum of human experience seen through alien eyes. "Why are you here?" I finally managed to think. "We are explorers, like you. But we are also refugees. Our world is dying, has been dying for centuries. We search for understanding, for hope, for signs that intelligence can overcome its own destructive nature." The being moved closer, and I could feel warmth radiating from its form, not heat, but something deeper. Compassion, maybe. "You are afraid of us," it continued. "Your governments know we are here but keep this knowledge hidden. They fear panic, fear losing control. But individuals like you, those who see us by chance, you react with wonder instead of terror. This gives us hope." "What do you want from us?" I asked. "Nothing. Everything. We want to learn. We want to help. We want to survive. But we cannot interfere directly. Your species must find its own path, make its own choices. We can only observe and hope." The craft behind the being began to pulse brighter. Time was running out. "Will I see you again?" I asked. "Perhaps. Or perhaps you will see others like us. We are not alone in this galaxy, and neither are you. The universe is vast and full of wonders, but also full of dangers. Your species stands at a crossroads. The choices you make in the coming decades will determine whether you join the community of worlds or follow the path to extinction." The being began to back toward its craft, but its voice remained clear in my mind. "Remember this moment. Remember that you are not alone. And remember that intelligence, no matter how alien it may seem, recognizes intelligence. We are more alike than different, you and we. We all seek meaning in the darkness between the stars." The craft's door opened without sound, revealing an interior filled with that same soft, shifting light. The being paused at the threshold. "Your world is beautiful," it said. "Do not let it die." Then it was gone, disappeared into the craft. The door sealed seamlessly, and the entire vessel began to rise. It moved through the trees like they weren't there, gaining altitude until it was just another point of light in the star-filled sky. I stood in that clearing for a long time after it vanished. The grass where the craft had rested was warm to the touch and glowed faintly in the darkness. By morning, I knew there would be no trace of what had happened here. When I finally made it back to my truck, everything was normal again. The radio crackled back to life. My phone showed full signal, and the dashboard clock resumed its steady count of seconds. It was as if the world had been holding its breath and finally exhaled. I drove home in silence, my mind racing with everything I'd seen and heard. Part of me wondered if I'd imagined it all, if the stress of work and life had finally caught up with me, but I could still feel the warmth of that being's presence, still hear its voice echoing in my thoughts. The next morning, I almost convinced myself it had been a dream. But when I went to put on my work boots, I found something impossible. The soles were covered in a fine, silvery dust that seemed to move and shift in the light. Dust from another world, carried back on my feet. I kept that dust in a small jar for weeks, watching it swirl and dance whenever I held it up to the light. Eventually, it faded, became ordinary dirt, but I knew what I had seen, what I had experienced. That was 3 months ago. I haven't seen the craft again, but I know it's out there. They're out there, watching, waiting, hoping that we'll find our way to something better. Sometimes, on clear nights, I drive back to that stretch of country road and pull over to look at the stars. I wonder if somewhere among those points of light, another being is looking back, remembering our brief encounter, still hoping that humanity will choose wisdom over destruction. The universe is vast and full of wonders, the being had told me, and we are not alone. In the darkness between the stars, intelligence calls out to intelligence, seeking connection, understanding, hope. I think about that often as I drift off to sleep. About the loneliness of space, the courage it takes to reach across impossible distances, and the simple truth that no matter how different we may appear, all conscious beings share the same fundamental desire to understand and be understood. Maybe that's enough to build a future on. Maybe that's all we need. Sweet dreams, everyone. And remember, you're never truly alone in this vast, mysterious universe. There's always someone out there, looking up at the same stars, wondering the same things, hoping for the same connections that make existence meaningful. Sleep tight. Sleep tight. Disturbing, real alien stories. Part 2. The construction site wasn't supposed to be dangerous. I'd been working heavy machinery for 15 years, and safety protocols were second nature to me. But what happened that Tuesday morning in October changed everything I thought I knew about the world around us. I was operating a bulldozer, clearing ground for a new shopping center on the outskirts of town. The land had been farmland for decades, nothing but cornfields and old irrigation ditches. Standard job, standard pay, nothing unusual about it. We'd been working the site for 3 weeks without incident. Around 10:30 in the morning, I was pushing a pile of dirt when the blade hit something solid. Not a rock or buried concrete, something that gave off a metallic clang that echoed across the site. I shut off the engine and climbed down to investigate. What I found buried about 4 feet down was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It was a smooth, curved surface made of some kind of metal that didn't look like steel or aluminum. The color was hard to describe, somewhere between silver and bronze with an almost liquid sheen to it. The surface was perfectly smooth, no seams or joints visible. I called over my foreman, Mike, and a couple of the other guys. Nobody could explain what it was. Mike thought maybe it was an old septic tank or some kind of industrial equipment left behind by previous development. But the shape was wrong, and the material didn't match anything we knew. We spent the next hour carefully excavating around the object. What we uncovered was a disc-shaped structure, maybe 20 feet across and about 6 feet thick at the center. The entire thing was made of that same strange metal, and despite being buried for who knows how long, there wasn't a speck of rust or corrosion on it. The really unsettling part was how warm it felt. Even though it had been underground, the metal was noticeably warm to the touch. Not hot, just warm, like it had been sitting in sunlight. Mike radioed the site supervisor, who told us to stop work and wait for instructions. While we waited, I walked around the perimeter of the object, running my hand along the surface. About halfway around, I found what looked like a seam or crack in the metal. It was barely visible, just a hairline that ran in a gentle arc across the surface. When I pressed against it, the metal gave slightly, like it was flexible. That's when things got strange. The moment I applied pressure to that seam, the entire object began to emit a low humming sound. It wasn't loud, more like a vibration you could feel in your chest than something you heard with your ears. The other workers backed away, but I stayed close, fascinated despite the growing unease in my gut. The humming intensified, and the warm metal under my palm grew warmer. Then, without warning, a section of the surface began to slide away, revealing an opening about 3 feet wide. The edges moved smoothly, silently, like they were designed to open that way. Inside was darkness, but not complete darkness. There was a faint bluish glow emanating from somewhere deeper within the structure. The air that drifted out didn't smell stale or musty like you'd expect from something buried underground. Instead, it had a clean, almost sterile scent, with a hint of something sweet I couldn't identify. Mike was shouting for everyone to get back, but I couldn't move. The opening seemed to be waiting for something, and I felt an overwhelming urge to look inside. Against every instinct that told me to run, I leaned forward and peered into the structure. What I saw defied explanation. The interior was much larger than the exterior dimensions should have allowed. The walls curved away into a space that seemed to extend far beyond what was physically possible. The bluish glow came from panels or screens that lined the walls, displaying symbols and patterns that shifted and changed like living things. But it wasn't empty. There were shapes inside, forms that might have been furniture or equipment, but designed for beings that weren't human. Everything was too tall, too narrow, with curves and angles that made no ergonomic sense for human use. As I stared into that impossible space, I became aware of a presence. Not something I could see, but something that felt aware of me in return. It wasn't threatening exactly, but it was alien in a way that made my skin crawl. Whatever had built this thing, they were still here in some way, watching through systems I couldn't understand. The feeling intensified, and suddenly I was overwhelmed by images that weren't my own thoughts. I saw the Earth from space, but not as it looked now. The continents were in different positions, the ice caps were gone, and strange geometric structures dotted the surface like a vast network. I saw beings that looked almost human, but weren't quite right. Tall and thin, with elongated limbs and faces that were both beautiful and unsettling. The visions came faster, showing me glimpses of technologies beyond anything we'd developed. Cities that floated in the sky, vehicles that moved without any visible means of propulsion. And through it all, I felt a sense of sadness, of loss, as if these beings were remembering something precious that had been taken from them. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the connection broke. The opening began to close, the metal sliding back into place with the same silent precision it had opened with. The humming faded, and the warm surface under my hand returned to normal temperature. I stumbled backward, my head spinning from what I'd experienced. Mike was beside me, asking if I was okay, but I couldn't find words to explain what had just happened. The other workers were staring at the spot where the opening had been, but now it looked like solid metal again, no seam visible. Within an hour, men in dark suits arrived at the site. They weren't from any government agency I recognized, and they didn't offer any identification. They ordered everyone off the property and set up a perimeter around the excavation. We were told the site was contaminated and that we'd be compensated for the lost work, but we were not to discuss what we'd found with anyone. I tried to argue, to tell them about what I'd seen inside the structure, but they weren't interested in hearing it. One of them, a thin man with cold eyes, pulled me aside and made it clear that talking about the incident would be very bad for my career and my family's safety. The next day, I drove past the site. The entire area had been covered with fresh dirt, and new grass had been planted. It looked like nothing had ever been disturbed there. The shopping center project was quietly canceled, and the land was sold to a private buyer who turned it into a nature preserve. I never saw the object again, and I never found out what happened to it. But sometimes, late at night, I still dream about that impossible space inside the metal disc. I dream about the beings who built it and the sadness I felt from them. And I wonder if they're still out there, buried under other construction sites, waiting for someone else to accidentally disturb their hiding places. The worst part is the knowledge that we're not alone, and that whatever is sharing this planet with us, they're keeping secrets that could change everything we think we know about our history and our place in the universe. Sometimes I wish I'd never found that object, never looked inside, never felt that alien presence touching my mind. But mostly, I wish I could go back and learn more, even if it meant facing whatever truth they were trying to hide from us. Part 3. The Weight of Memory. Sometimes, the most profound encounters are the ones that find you when you least expect them, the kind that slip into your life like shadows, leaving you questioning everything you thought you knew about the world. What I'm about to share happened to me 3 years ago, and I still wake up some nights wondering if it was real or just the most vivid dream I've ever had. I was driving home from a wedding in Vermont, taking the back roads because I'd always preferred them to the highway. There's something peaceful about those winding country roads at night, where the only light comes from your headlights cutting through the darkness. I'd made this drive dozens of times before, so when I noticed the exit I usually took was blocked by construction. I didn't think much of it. I just followed the detour signs deeper into the countryside. That's when things started to feel off. The detour seemed to go on longer than it should have, taking me through areas I didn't recognize despite having lived in the region my entire life. The road curved through dense forest, and my GPS kept losing signal, showing nothing but a blank screen. I told myself it was just a dead zone, that I'd pick up the signal again once I got back to familiar territory. But the road kept winding deeper into nowhere. No houses, no streetlights, not even the occasional gas station. Just trees pressing in on both sides, and this growing sense that I was moving further away from where I needed to be. I should have turned around, but something kept me driving forward. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe something else was guiding me down that road. After what felt like hours, I crested a small hill and saw lights ahead. Not street lights or house lights, but something else entirely. They were arranged in a perfect grid pattern, floating about 10 feet off the ground above what looked like an empty field. Each light pulsed gently, cycling through colors I'd never seen before. Colors that seemed to exist somewhere between blue and silver, between green and gold. I pulled over and got out of the car, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The air was completely still, and there was this profound silence that felt almost sacred. No insects, no wind, no distant traffic. Just me and those impossible lights hanging in the darkness like stars that had fallen too close to Earth. As I watched, one of the lights began to descend. It moved with such grace, such purpose, that I knew immediately this wasn't some weather phenomenon or military exercise. It settled on the ground about 50 feet away from me, and I could see it wasn't really a light at all. It was more like a window, showing glimpses of somewhere else entirely. Through that window, I saw a vast city unlike anything on Earth. Buildings that seemed to grow rather than be built, reaching toward a sky filled with 3 moons, and moving through that city were beings of such beauty and strangeness that my mind struggled to process what I was seeing. They looked almost human, but taller, more graceful, with skin that seemed to shimmer with its own inner light. One of them noticed me watching. Our eyes met across the impossible distance between worlds, and in that moment something passed between us. Not words, not thoughts exactly, but a deep understanding. I felt their curiosity about me, their surprise at making contact, and underneath it all, a profound sadness. They showed me things then, images that flowed directly into my mind. I saw Earth as they saw it, a beautiful blue marble spinning in the darkness, but wounded somehow. I saw the connections between all living things, the delicate web of energy that binds everything together, and how that web was fraying. They weren't here to invade or conquer. They were here because they cared, because they recognized something precious that was in danger of being lost. But the most powerful thing they shared with me wasn't a vision of distant worlds or cosmic truths. It was a memory, my memory. They showed me my grandmother, who had passed away 5 years earlier, sitting in her garden on a summer afternoon. But in their version of the memory, I could see what I'd missed at the time. The way the sunlight caught the silver in her hair, the gentle smile she wore when she thought no one was looking, the love that radiated from her like warmth from a fire. I realized then that they were collectors of sorts, but not of objects or specimens. They collected moments, the beautiful, fleeting instances that make life precious. Every act of kindness, every moment of wonder, every time someone looked at a sunset and felt something stir in their soul. They were preserving these moments, keeping them safe against some future darkness. The being on the other side of the window raised its hand, and I found myself doing the same. For just an instant our palms touched the surface of that impossible barrier between worlds, and I felt a warmth that seemed to come from the center of the universe itself. In that touch, they gave me a gift, not knowledge or power, but perspective. The ability to see the extraordinary in the ordinary, to recognize the moments worth preserving. Then, as gently as it had descended, the light began to rise. The window grew smaller and smaller until it was just a point of brilliance, then winked out entirely. The other lights in the grid followed, ascending into the star-filled sky until they were indistinguishable from the constellations above. I stood there for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. When I finally got back in my car, my GPS was working again, showing me exactly where I was and how to get home. The drive back took 20 minutes on roads I knew like the back of my hand. Roads that had somehow been there all along, hidden behind a construction barrier that was no longer there when I passed it again. The wedding photos I'd taken earlier that day were still on my camera, time-stamped just hours before, but something had changed in me during those missing hours. I started noticing things I'd never paid attention to before. The way morning light filters through leaves, the sound of rain on a roof, the expression on a stranger's face when they think no one is watching. I began to understand that we're all part of something larger, something beautiful and fragile that needs protecting. Every moment of genuine connection, every act of compassion, every time we choose love over fear adds another thread to that cosmic web they showed me. We're not just observers of life, we're participants in its preservation. Sometimes I wonder if that night really happened, or if it was my mind's way of processing something too big for rational thought. But then I'll catch a glimpse of something extraordinary in an ordinary moment. Feel that same warmth I felt when our hands touched across impossible distance, and I know it doesn't matter whether it was real in the way we usually define reality. What matters is what it taught me. That every day is filled with moments worth preserving. That consciousness isn't limited to our small blue planet, and that somewhere out there, beings of incredible wisdom and compassion are watching over the beautiful, fragile thing we call existence. The next time you see something that takes your breath away, remember that someone might be collecting that moment, preserving it against the darkness. In a way, that makes each of us curators of wonder, guardians of the precious moments that make life worth living. And maybe, if you're very lucky and very open to possibilities beyond our understanding, you might find yourself on a dark country road, watching lights dance in the sky, knowing that you're not alone in this vast, mysterious universe, that you're part of something bigger than yourself, something worth protecting, something worth preserving for generations yet to come. The memory keepers are out there, friends. They're watching, collecting, and hoping that we'll remember what makes us human, what makes us worth saving. The forest had always been my refuge, a place where the chaos of everyday life couldn't reach me. I'd been a wildlife photographer for over 15 years, capturing moments that most people never get to witness. But that autumn morning, deep in the Cascade Mountains, I became the subject being observed. I'd hiked 3 miles from the nearest trail, following deer paths and creek beds to reach a secluded valley I'd discovered months earlier. The mist hung low between the towering pines, creating an ethereal backdrop that photographers dream of. I was setting up my telephoto lens, hoping to catch the elk herd that frequented this area, when I noticed the silence. It wasn't the peaceful quiet of dawn breaking. This was something else entirely. No birds, no rustling leaves, no distant sounds of small animals moving through the underbrush. Even the creek seemed muted, its usual babbling reduced to barely a whisper. The forest was holding its breath. I lowered my camera and looked around. The mist had thickened, swirling in patterns that defied the still air. That's when I saw them moving through the fog, shapes that didn't belong. At first, I thought they were elk, their tall forms gliding silently between the trees. But as they drew closer, my rational mind began to reject what my eyes were seeing. They were humanoid but wrong in every conceivable way. 7 feet tall, maybe 8, with limbs that seemed too long and joints that bent at impossible angles. Their skin had a translucent quality, like frosted glass, and underneath I could see something pulsing, a network of veins or channels carrying a fluid that glowed with soft bioluminescence. There were 5 of them, moving in perfect synchronization through the mist. They didn't walk so much as flow, their feet barely touching the forest floor. No sound accompanied their movement, no broken twigs or displaced leaves. They were silent as ghosts, but far more substantial and terrifying. I crouched behind a fallen log, my heart hammering against my ribs. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like lead. These beings had an otherworldly grace that was both beautiful and deeply unsettling. They moved with purpose, as if following some invisible map, their elongated heads turning occasionally to scan their surroundings. One of them stopped directly in front of my hiding spot, its head tilted in my direction, and though it had no visible eyes or facial features, I felt its attention like a physical weight. The being stood there for what felt like an eternity, though it was probably only seconds. Then, without warning, images flooded my mind. I saw the forest from above, a bird's-eye view that revealed patterns I'd never noticed. Ancient paths crisscrossed the wilderness, forming geometric designs that suggested intelligence and planning. I saw myself from their perspective, a small, warm figure crouched behind rotting wood, radiating fear and confusion. But there was more. I glimpsed other places, other worlds. Vast cities that grew like living organisms, their buildings breathing and shifting in harmony with their inhabitants. Skies painted in colors that had no names, filled with structures that defied physics as I understood it. And everywhere, these graceful beings moved through their realm with the same silent purpose I was witnessing now. The vision lasted only moments before the connection was severed. The being's head straightened, and it rejoined its companions. They continued their journey through the mist, disappearing as silently as they had arrived. The normal sounds of the forest gradually returned, birds calling tentatively from the canopy, water resuming its cheerful babble over smooth stones. I remained frozen behind that log for another hour, waiting for my hands to stop shaking enough to pack my equipment. When I finally stood, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Where the beings had walked, the vegetation was different. Not damaged or dead, but changed. The grass grew in spirals, the moss formed intricate patterns, and the very air seemed to shimmer with residual energy. I never published the photographs I took that day, though I developed them countless times, studying every frame for evidence of what I'd witnessed. The images showed only empty forest, morning mist, and the usual interplay of light and shadow. But I know what I saw, what I felt when that alien consciousness touched mine. They weren't visitors to our world, I realized. They were gardeners, tending to something we couldn't perceive, maintaining a balance we didn't even know existed. The forest was their domain, and I had been permitted a glimpse into their ancient work. Sometimes, when I'm deep in the wilderness with my camera, I feel that familiar silence descending. The birds stop singing, the wind holds its breath, and the mist begins to move in patterns that speak of intelligence beyond our understanding. In those moments, I lower my camera and simply wait, hoping for another glimpse of the gardeners who tend to the hidden geometries of our world. I never approach those misty clearings anymore. Some mysteries are meant to be observed from a respectful distance, and some encounters leave you forever changed, carrying the weight of knowledge that sits uneasily in the spaces between what we think we know and what actually is. The forest keeps its secrets well, but occasionally, for those patient enough to listen, it whispers truths that redefine everything we thought we understood about our place in the vast, interconnected web of existence that extends far beyond the boundaries of our small, fragile world. Sleep Tight. Disturbing Real Alien Stories. Part 5. The maintenance job at the old observatory wasn't supposed to be complicated. 3 nights a week, check the equipment, log the readings, and make sure nobody was breaking into the building. The place had been abandoned by the university years ago, but some private foundation kept paying to maintain the basic systems. Easy money for someone who didn't mind being alone in the dark. I'd been working there for about 2 months when I started noticing the patterns. Every Tuesday and Friday, around 2:30 a.m., the old radio telescope would activate on its own. The control room computers would show it scanning specific coordinates, always the same section of sky. The first few times, I figured it was some automated program left running from the old research days. But when I checked the logs, there was no record of any scheduled operations. The telescope itself was ancient, built in the 1970s and supposedly decommissioned. Most of the control systems had been shut down when the university pulled out. Yet somehow, twice a week, it would come to life with a low mechanical hum that echoed through the entire building. I'd watch from the control room as the massive dish slowly rotated, its motors straining against decades of rust and neglect. I tried disabling the power to the telescope array, but the next Tuesday it activated anyway. I checked every circuit breaker, every connection I could find. Nothing should have been able to power that equipment. Yet there it was, moving with mechanical precision toward the same coordinates every time. The sound it made wasn't quite right either. Instead of the steady electric hum I expected, there was something organic about it, like breathing. One Friday night, I decided to trace the signal. The control room had old monitoring equipment that still functioned, most of it connected to receivers that should have been picking up cosmic background radiation. When the telescope activated at 2:28 a.m., I started recording everything. What I found didn't make sense. The telescope wasn't just pointing at empty space. It was receiving something. The data coming through looked like communication signals, structured and deliberate. Not the random noise you'd expect from deep space, but organized patterns that repeated with mathematical precision. I wasn't trained to interpret radio astronomy data, but even I could see this was artificial. The signals came in bursts, lasting exactly 17 minutes each time. During those 17 minutes, every piece of electronic equipment in the building would behave strangely. Lights would dim and brighten in sequence. The old computers would display fragments of text in languages I didn't recognize. Even my phone would heat up in my pocket, the screen flickering with symbols that hurt to look at directly. I started keeping detailed logs of everything: the coordinates the telescope pointed to, the timing of the signals, the strange behavior of the electronics. I even tried to decode some of the data, spending hours staring at printouts covered in numbers and patterns. Slowly, I began to see structure in the chaos. The signals weren't random, they were responding to something. That's when I realized the telescope wasn't just receiving, it was transmitting. Hidden in the basement of the observatory, I found equipment that wasn't on any of the building schematics. Powerful transmitters connected to the main telescope array through cables that had been carefully concealed behind walls and under floors. Someone had modified the entire system, turning it into a communication array. But communication with what? The answer came on a Tuesday night in November. I was in the control room when the usual activation began, but this time something was different. Instead of the normal 17-minute cycle, the signals kept coming. Hour after hour, the data flowed through the system with increasing intensity. The building's electrical systems couldn't handle the load. Lights exploded in showers of sparks. The air itself seemed to vibrate with energy. That's when I saw them through the control room window. 3 figures stood in the field beyond the telescope, perfectly still in the November cold. They were tall, maybe 7 feet, with proportions that weren't quite human. Their skin had a translucent quality, like looking through frosted glass, but it was their eyes that made my blood freeze, large, dark, and completely focused on the building where I stood. They didn't move for the longest time, just watched as the telescope completed its rotation and locked onto their position. The signals flowing through the equipment reached a crescendo, filling the control room with sound that was felt more than heard. My vision blurred. My hands shook as I gripped the edge of the console. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The telescope powered down, the signals ceased. The figures in the field were gone, leaving only disturbed grass where they had stood. The silence that followed was so complete it made my ears ring. I found the message the next morning, displayed on every computer screen in the building. Not in English, but somehow I understood it perfectly. A simple statement that chilled me to the bone. Location confirmed. Preparation complete. Thank you for your assistance. I quit that same day, but not before destroying every piece of equipment I could find. I pulled cables, smashed hard drives, and cut power lines until the building was truly dead. The foundation that owned the place never contacted me about the damage. When I drove past the observatory a few weeks later, it was being demolished. But sometimes late at night I still hear that mechanical humming. Not from any building or machine, but from the sky itself. And I know that somewhere out there, other telescopes are pointing toward coordinates I helped confirm, sending signals to beings who are no longer waiting. They're here. The rental cabin was supposed to be isolated, which was exactly what I wanted after 6 months of city noise and deadline pressure. 3 days alone in the mountains with nothing but books and silence. The property manager had warned me that cell service was spotty, and the landline was unreliable. But that sounded perfect. Complete disconnection from the world. The first day went exactly as planned. I hiked the trails around the cabin, read by the fireplace, and enjoyed the kind of deep quiet you can only find miles from civilization. The cabin itself was rustic but comfortable, with thick log walls and windows that looked out over a valley filled with pine trees. At night, the darkness was so complete, I could see the Milky Way stretched across the sky like a river of light. It was on the second night that I noticed the knocking, 3 soft taps on the front door. so quiet I almost missed them over the crackling of the fire. When I opened the door, no one was there. The porch was empty, and the motion sensor light hadn't even activated. I chalked it up to the old building settling, or maybe an animal bumping against the door, but it happened again an hour later. 3 taps, soft but deliberate. This time I was ready, moving to the door as quietly as possible and yanking it open immediately. Still nothing. The porch light revealed only empty space and the dark line of trees beyond. I started paying attention to the timing. The knocking came every hour, always 3 taps, always on the front door. Never loud enough to be startling, but consistent enough to be noticeable. By midnight, I was sitting in a chair facing the door, waiting for the next occurrence. At exactly 1 a.m., the taps came, but this time I heard something else. Footsteps on the porch, slow and deliberate, moving from the door toward the windows. I grabbed a flashlight and moved to the side window, peering through the curtains. In the beam of light I saw them, footprints in the thin layer of snow that had fallen that evening. Bare, human footprints, but wrong somehow. Too long, with toes that were stretched and thin. They led from the front door around the entire perimeter of the cabin, circling it like someone had been walking the same path over and over. The prints were fresh, made within the last few hours. But I'd been inside the entire time, and I hadn't seen or heard anyone approach. The nearest neighbor was 5 miles away down a winding mountain road. There was no reason for anyone to be walking barefoot around my cabin in the snow. I followed the prints with my flashlight, watching as they completed perfect circles around the building. At some points, they came right up to the windows, as if someone had been standing there looking in. The thought made my skin crawl. How long had they been watching before I noticed the knocking? Sleep was impossible after that. I sat in the living room with all the lights on, listening for any sound from outside. The knocking didn't come again that night, but I could feel a presence beyond the walls, something patient and persistent, waiting for me to let my guard down. The third morning, I found them in the kitchen. Not the person making the footprints, but the prints themselves. Wet marks on the linoleum floor, the same elongated shape as the ones in the snow. They led from the back door to the refrigerator, then to the sink, then back to the door, as if someone had come inside during the night and calmly helped themselves to food and water. The back door was still locked. The windows were latched from the inside. There was no way for anyone to have entered the cabin without me knowing. Yet the footprints were there, still damp with melted snow. I packed my things and left within the hour, not bothering to clean up or even turn off the lights. As I loaded my car, I could feel eyes watching from the tree line. I didn't look back, didn't try to see who or what was out there. I just drove away as fast as the mountain roads would allow, but I made a mistake. In my hurry to leave, I forgot to check the back seat of my car. I was 20 miles down the mountain when I heard it. 3 soft taps, not on a door this time, but on the rear window of my car. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw nothing but empty road behind me. But the tapping continued, patient and rhythmic, following me down the winding highway. I didn't stop driving until I reached the city. Even then, even surrounded by traffic and people and noise, I could still hear those 3 soft taps echoing in my mind. And sometimes, late at night in my apartment, I hear them at my door. Always the same pattern, always the same patience. They followed me home. The technical writing job seemed perfect. Work remotely, good pay, and the client only needed someone to document their research facility's procedures. Simple stuff, they said. Safety protocols, equipment manuals, nothing complicated. The fact that I had to sign 3 different non-disclosure agreements should have been a red flag, but the money was too good to pass up. They sent me files electronically, hundreds of pages of notes and observations that needed to be organized into coherent documentation. Most of it was standard scientific material, but some of the terminology was unfamiliar. References to subjects and containment protocols and behavioral modifications that seemed more suited to a psychological study than the materials research they claimed to be doing. The work itself was straightforward enough. I reorganized their data, clarified their procedures, and created user-friendly manuals from their technical notes. But the more I read, the more questions I had. Why did a materials lab need detailed protocols for subject interaction? What kind of research required psychological containment measures? I tried asking my contact at the company, a Dr. Sarah Chen who served as my liaison. Her responses were always vague, redirecting my questions back to the technical writing tasks. Just focus on making the procedures clear, she'd say. The context isn't important for your work. But context became impossible to ignore when I started finding the video files. They were embedded in some of the documents, hidden in folders labeled as reference materials. The first few seemed innocent enough, just security camera footage of empty laboratories and corridors. But then I found the ones labeled subject interaction logs. The videos showed a sterile white room with a single chair in the center. No windows, no decorations, just blank walls and harsh fluorescent lighting. In each video, someone would be brought into the room and seated in the chair. They looked normal, just ordinary people of various ages and backgrounds, but their eyes were wrong. Vacant, staring, like they were looking at something no one else could see. Then the interviews would begin. A voice from off-camera, clinical and detached, would ask questions. Simple things at first. Name, age, where they were from. But the answers were all wrong. The subjects would respond with descriptions of places that didn't exist, events that couldn't have happened, memories of experiences that defied explanation. One woman described living in a city made of crystal, where the buildings grew like plants and the inhabitants communicated through colors. A man talked about working in vast underground factories where machines built themselves and time moved differently than on the surface. A teenager explained in detail how to navigate between dimensions as if it were as simple as crossing the street. The interviewers seemed to expect these answers. They took careful notes, asked follow-up questions, and showed no surprise at even the most impossible descriptions. It was like they were documenting some elaborate shared delusion. Except the subjects had never met each other in their stories. While strange, were internally consistent. I kept watching, unable to stop despite the growing unease in my stomach. In video after video, ordinary people described extraordinary experiences with the calm certainty of someone discussing the weather. They talked about beings made of light, about cities that existed in the spaces between thoughts, about technologies that operated on principles I couldn't begin to understand. But it was the final video that made me understand what I was really documenting. The subject was a man in his 50s, wearing the same blank expression as all the others. But when the interviewer asked him about his experiences, he turned to look directly at the camera. His eyes, previously vacant and distant, suddenly focused with sharp intelligence. "You're watching this, aren't you?" he said, his voice clear and certain. "The one they hired to organize our stories, the writer." I froze, my hand hovering over the mouse. This video was supposedly recorded months ago, long before I'd been hired for this project. There was no way he could have known about me. "They told us someone would be watching eventually," the man continued. "Someone who would help them understand what we've seen, what we've learned. They think they're studying us, but we're studying them too. And now we're studying you." The interviewer's voice cut in, sharp with alarm. "Subject 47, please respond to the original question about your temporal displacement experiences." The man smiled, never taking his eyes off the camera. "She's listening," The writer. She can hear us now, can't she? The connection is getting stronger. That's when I realized I could hear more than just the video. Whispers, faint but growing clearer, coming from my speakers even though the audio on the video had gone silent. Multiple voices, overlapping and harmonizing, speaking words I couldn't quite understand, but somehow knew the meaning of. They were calling to me. I slammed the laptop shut and backed away from my desk, but the whispers didn't stop. They continued, seeming to come from the walls themselves, describing places I'd never been and experiences I'd never had. But as I listened, memories that weren't mine began to surface. Images of crystal cities and dimensional gateways, knowledge of technologies that shouldn't exist. I tried to call Dr. Chen, but her number was disconnected. I searched for the research facility online, but found no trace of it. Even the email address they'd been using to send me files bounced back as undeliverable. It was as if the entire project had vanished, but the whispers remained. And with them came the understanding that I hadn't been hired to document their research. I'd been recruited to join it. The technical writing was just the method they used to create a connection, to slowly expose me to the knowledge their subjects possessed. Now, I understand what those people in the videos were trying to tell me. They weren't delusional, they were preparing, and so am I. The connection is getting stronger every day. Working as a forest ranger meant dealing with all kinds of situations. Lost hikers, injured campers, the occasional wildfire. But nothing in my training had prepared me for what I found during my patrol that October morning. The call came in around 6 a.m. Campers at Wildrose Creek reported strange lights in the forest during the night, moving through the trees in coordinated patterns. Probably just other campers with flashlights, but protocol required me to check it out. I loaded my gear into the truck and headed up the mountain road as the sun was starting to filter through the canopy. Wildrose Creek was about 8 miles into the forest, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that wound through some of the densest woodland in the park. The area was popular with experienced campers because of its isolation, but it wasn't unusual for people to get spooked by the silence and shadows. I'd made this trip dozens of times to reassure nervous visitors that the sounds they heard were just animals going about their business. But when I reached the camping area, it was empty. No tents, no vehicles, no sign that anyone had been there recently. The fire ring was cold, with no evidence of recent use. Either the campers who called had already left, or they'd given me the wrong location. I was about to radio back to the station when I noticed the trees. In a perfect circle around the camping area, every tree within about 50 feet had been marked. Not carved or damaged, but marked with symbols that seemed to shimmer in the morning light. They looked almost like burns, but the bark wasn't charred or damaged. Instead, the marks appeared to have been somehow pressed into the wood, creating patterns that were too complex and precise to be natural. I approached one of the marked trees, pulling out my camera to document what I was seeing. Through the viewfinder, the symbols looked different, more three-dimensional, as if they were floating just above the surface of the bark. When I lowered the camera, they appeared flat again, just marks on wood. Each tree bore a different pattern, but they all had the same quality of movement when viewed through the camera. Spirals that seemed to rotate, geometric shapes that shifted and rearranged themselves, symbols that looked almost like writing, but in no language I recognized. I took photos of every marked tree, though I doubted the images would capture what I was really seeing. It was while I was documenting the symbols that I heard the humming, low and musical, coming from deeper in the forest. Not quite human, but not quite animal either. It had a harmony to it, multiple tones weaving together in patterns that seemed to match the symbols on the trees. I followed the sound, moving carefully through the underbrush with my radio ready. The humming led me to a clearing I'd never seen before. despite years of patrolling this area. It was perfectly circular, about 30 feet across, with grass that was so uniformly green it looked artificial. In the center of the clearing stood a single tree, ancient and massive, its trunk easily 10 feet in diameter. But this tree was covered in symbols from base to crown, thousands of them, overlapping and interweaving in patterns that made my eyes water to look at directly. And they were moving. Not the subtle shifting I'd seen through the camera, but active, constant motion. The symbols flowed around the trunk like water, rearranging themselves in ever-changing configurations. The humming was coming from the tree itself. I stood at the edge of the clearing, afraid to step onto that perfect grass, and watched as the symbols pulsed and shifted in rhythm with the sound. It was beautiful and terrifying at the same time, like watching something that existed beyond the normal rules of reality. That's when I saw them. Figures standing among the trees at the far edge of the clearing, so still I'd mistaken them for shadows. Tall and thin, with skin that had the same translucent quality as the symbols on the bark. They didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence, just watched as the ancient tree continued its silent song. I tried to count them, but my eyes kept sliding away from their forms. Sometimes I thought I saw 3, sometimes a dozen. They seemed to exist partially in the spaces between perception, visible only when I wasn't looking directly at them. The humming grew louder, and I felt a pressure in my mind like someone gently pushing against my thoughts. Not invasive or threatening, but insistent. Images began to form in my consciousness. The forest, as it had been centuries ago, before any human had walked these paths. The tree in its youth, already marked with symbols that told stories of things that existed between the spaces of normal reality. I understood, without being told, that this place was a marker, a signpost for travelers who moved through dimensions the way I moved through the forest. The symbols were a language of location and time, telling others of their kind that this world was inhabited, protected, watched over. The figures among the trees weren't threatening the forest. They were its guardians. The pressure in my mind increased, and suddenly I knew that my presence here wasn't accidental. I'd been guided to this place, drawn by the same instinct that had made me become a forest ranger in the first place. The desire to protect wild spaces, to preserve them for future generations. But now I understood that some of those future generations might not be human. The humming began to fade, and the symbols on the tree slowed their movement until they were almost still. The figures among the trees started to dissolve, becoming shadow and suggestion again. But before they disappeared completely, I felt one final touch against my thoughts, a feeling of gratitude, of recognition, of welcome. I walked back to my truck in a daze, my mind struggling to process what I'd experienced. The marked trees around the camping area were gone, their bark smooth and unmarked as if the symbols had never existed. But in my camera, the photos remained, evidence of something beyond normal understanding. I never reported what I found that day. How could I? Instead, I've become more attentive during my patrols, more aware of the subtle signs that something extraordinary shares these woods with the more mundane wildlife. I've learned to recognize the places where reality grows thin, where other kinds of travelers rest during their journeys between worlds. And sometimes, on quiet nights when the forest holds its breath, I can still hear that ancient tree humming its song of welcome to visitors from beyond the stars. The museum night shift was supposed to be easy money. Walk the halls every hour, check that the exhibits were secure, and make sure no one had broken in through the loading dock. The Natural History Museum had been having budget problems, so they'd cut back to a single night watchman instead of the usual security team, perfect for a college student who needed to study during work hours. Most nights, the job lived up to its reputation for being boring. The building was old and made settling noises, but nothing I couldn't handle with headphones and a good book. The dinosaur skeletons cast strange shadows in the emergency lighting, and the mineral collection sparkled in the display cases, but it was all familiar after the first week. It was during my third week that I first noticed the sounds from the storage areas. The museum kept most of its collection in climate-controlled rooms behind the public exhibits. Thousands of specimens, artifacts, and fossils that weren't on display, organized in numbered cases and cataloged with scientific precision. I wasn't supposed to go into storage unless there was a security issue, but the sounds were definitely coming from back there, not breaking and entering sounds. More like movement, soft scraping, like something being dragged across the floor, the occasional thump of something heavy being set down. It was rhythmic and purposeful, not the random noises you'd expect from building systems or settling structures. I grabbed my flashlight and headed into the storage area, following the sounds through a maze of metal shelving units. The museum's collection was vast, with specimens dating back over a century, rocks and fossils, preserved insects, animal skeletons, and artifacts from archaeological digs around the world. Most of it hadn't been touched in years, but someone had been moving things. Display cases that had been covered with dust sheets were now exposed. Specimens that should have been in storage containers were arranged on tables, as if someone was studying them. Not damaged or stolen, just relocated, as if a researcher had been working late and forgotten to clean up. I checked the sign-in logs and access records. No one had been in the building after hours, the door alarms hadn't been triggered, and my keycard was the only one used since the building closed. Yet someone had clearly been working in storage, moving specimens around with careful attention to their preservation. The sounds continued over the next several nights, always from different areas of storage. I started mapping where I heard the activity, trying to find a pattern. It seemed to move through the collection systematically, as if someone was conducting a thorough survey of everything the museum owned. On Friday night, I decided to stay hidden and watch. I positioned myself behind a bank of specimen cabinets and waited. Around 2 a.m., the sounds began again. Soft footsteps moving through the storage area with confident familiarity. The scrape of cases being moved, the rustle of protective coverings being removed. Whoever it was knew their way around the collection. I peered around the edge of the cabinet and saw them. 3 figures moving through the storage area with silent efficiency. They were tall and thin, wearing what looked like dark clothing, but something was wrong with their proportions. Their limbs were too long, their movements too fluid. They handled the museum specimens with careful precision, examining each item under small lights that cast no shadows. I tried to get a better look, moving closer while staying hidden behind the shelving units. That's when I realized they weren't wearing dark clothing. Their skin was dark, with a texture that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And their hands weren't quite human. Too many joints, fingers that moved in ways that made my eyes water to watch. They were cataloging the collection. Each specimen was examined, measured with instruments I didn't recognize, and then carefully photographed from multiple angles. They worked with the methodical precision of scientists, but their equipment wasn't anything I'd seen before. Devices that hummed softly and projected holographic displays, scanners that seemed to see through solid matter. I watched them work for over an hour, documenting specimen after specimen with thorough attention to detail. They showed particular interest in the fossil collection, spending extra time with samples that had been labeled as unknown origin or classification pending. Pieces that had puzzled the museum's researchers for decades. Then one of them looked directly at me. I froze, pressing myself against the storage cabinet, but it was too late. The figure had seen me hiding among the shelves. For a long moment, we stared at each other across the storage room. Its eyes were large and dark, reflecting my flashlight beam like an animal's. But there was intelligence there, and something that might have been curiosity. The other two figures stopped their work and turned to look at me as well. I expected them to flee or attack, but instead they simply watched, as if they were as surprised to see me as I was to see them. The silence stretched between us, heavy with the weight of impossible discovery. Then the first figure did something that made my blood freeze. It raised one elongated hand and pointed at a specimen case nearby. Following its gesture, I saw what they had been examining, a fossil that had been discovered in a coal mine decades ago, labeled only as unidentified metallic object, geological age inconsistent with surrounding strata. The figure pointed to the fossil, then to itself, then back to the fossil. The meaning was clear. They weren't just cataloging our collection. They were identifying their own artifacts, lost pieces of their technology that had been buried in Earth's geological layers and eventually found their way into our museums. We had been unknowingly collecting evidence of their presence for over a century. The figure reached into what I now realized wasn't clothing, but some kind of organic covering, and withdrew a device similar to the ones they'd been using to scan specimens. It pointed the device at me, and I felt a strange tingling sensation, like static electricity dancing across my skin. After a moment, it lowered the device and made a sound that might have been communication to its companions. Not words, but musical tones that conveyed meaning I couldn't grasp. The other two responded with similar sounds, their conversation flowing in harmonies that seemed to bypass my ears and resonate directly in my bones. Then they began to pack up their equipment. I watched in fascination as they carefully returned each specimen to its proper location, replacing dust covers and ensuring everything was exactly as they'd found it. Their cleanup was as methodical as their research had been, leaving no trace of their presence except for the impossible memory burned into my mind. Before they left, the first figure approached me one more time. It extended its hand, holding a small object that looked like a piece of dark crystal. When I hesitantly reached out to take it, the crystal was warm and seemed to pulse with internal light. The moment it touched my palm, images flooded my consciousness. Vast cities that existed in the spaces between dimensions. Libraries that contained the collected knowledge of 1,000 worlds. Museums like this one, but filled with wonders I couldn't begin to comprehend, and throughout it all the understanding that knowledge was meant to be shared, preserved, and protected. They were researchers, just like the human scientists who worked in this museum during the day. The only difference was the scope of their study encompassed realities beyond our current understanding. When the visions faded, the figures were gone. I stood alone in the storage area, holding the crystal and trying to convince myself that what I'd experienced was real. The specimens around me looked the same as always, but now I knew that some of them were far more significant than their labels suggested. I still work the night shift at the museum, but my job has changed. I've become a liaison of sorts, though I doubt the museum administration would understand if I tried to explain. Some nights, the researchers return, and I make sure they're not disturbed while they continue their catalog of artifacts scattered across our world. The crystal they gave me serves as a communication device. When they need access to particular specimens, it grows warm and fills my mind with images of what they're looking for. I've learned to read their needs and prepare the storage areas for their visits. In return, they've begun leaving me gifts. Not artifacts or technology, but knowledge. Understanding of the true history hidden in our collection. The real stories behind the mysterious objects that have puzzled human scientists for generations. I've started keeping detailed notes, building a secret catalog that exists parallel to the museum's official records. Sometimes I wonder what would happen if I told someone, if I shared the crystal or tried to photograph one of their visits. But I've come to understand that some knowledge isn't meant to be forced into the light. Some discoveries have to be made when the world is ready to accept them. Until then, I'll continue to guard their work as carefully as they guard their secrets. After all, we're all in the business of preserving knowledge for future generations, even if those generations might come from somewhere beyond the stars. The night everything changed started like any other at the radio telescope facility. I was alone on the observation shift, monitoring automated scans while the rest of the team slept in the dormitories. It was peaceful work, watching data streams, the watcher among the stars. The first time it happened, I thought I was losing my mind. I've been an air traffic controller for over 15 years, tracking aircraft across the endless expanse of night sky. So I've seen everything: commercial jets, military exercises, weather balloons, even the occasional drone where it shouldn't be. But what I witnessed 3 months ago changed everything. I thought I knew about what flies through our airspace. It was a quiet Tuesday evening, the kind where the radar screens showed only the usual traffic patterns: commercial flights following their predetermined routes, a few private aircraft making their way to regional airports. Nothing unusual. The coffee was fresh. My colleague Sarah was reviewing flight logs, and the radio chatter was routine, just another ordinary night at the tower. Then the radar picked up something that shouldn't have been there. At first, it appeared as a single blip on the screen, moving at an impossible speed. Not the gradual progression of a commercial airliner or the predictable arc of a satellite, but something that seemed to dart across vast distances in mere seconds. I adjusted the display, thinking it was an equipment malfunction. The blip vanished, then reappeared several miles away, as if it had simply jumped through space. Sarah noticed my confusion and moved closer to the screen. Together, we watched as the object performed maneuvers that defied every principle of aerodynamics we knew. It would hover motionless for minutes, then accelerate to speeds that should have torn any known aircraft apart. It made 90-degree turns without slowing down, movements that would have been fatal to any human pilot. We tried to establish radio contact, broadcasting on every frequency we monitored. Nothing. No response, no identification, no flight plan on file. According to our systems, this craft didn't exist, yet there it was, moving through controlled airspace with complete disregard for aviation protocols. The object seemed to be observing our aircraft. It would approach commercial flights, matching their speed and altitude for several minutes before darting away. The commercial pilots never reported visual contact, never seemed aware they were being shadowed. It was as if the object could see them, but remained invisible to their instruments and eyes. For nearly an hour, we tracked its erratic movements. It would disappear from radar for minutes at a time, only to reappear in an entirely different sector of our airspace. The pattern seemed random, yet there was an intelligence behind it, a purpose we couldn't understand. Then it began communicating with us, not through radio waves or any conventional means, but through the radar system itself. The blip started moving in deliberate patterns, geometric shapes, mathematical sequences, formations that were clearly artificial. It was using our own technology to send us a message, manipulating how it appeared on our screens to create symbols and designs. Sarah and I documented everything: screenshots of the patterns, timestamps of each maneuver, detailed logs of its impossible flight characteristics. We were witnessing something unprecedented, something that challenged everything we understood about physics and aviation. The most unsettling moment came when the object seemed to focus its attention directly on our control tower. It moved to a position directly overhead and remained stationary for exactly 10 minutes. During that time, every piece of electronic equipment in the facility experienced minor glitches. Screens flickered, radio transmissions became unclear, and our primary radar showed interference patterns we'd never seen before. It was studying us as much as we were studying it. When it finally departed, it didn't gradually fade from our screens like a conventional aircraft leaving our coverage area. Instead, it accelerated straight up at a speed that our instruments couldn't accurately measure, disappearing from radar as if it had left Earth's atmosphere entirely. We filed our reports, knowing they would likely be dismissed or classified. Official channels don't typically welcome accounts of unidentified objects performing impossible maneuvers in controlled airspace. But the evidence was undeniable. Something had been watching our skies, observing our aircraft, and attempting to communicate with those who monitor the heavens. Since that night, I've paid closer attention to the unusual readings that cross our screens, the brief anomalies that might be explained away as equipment errors or atmospheric phenomena. I've begun to notice patterns in these irregularities, subtle signs that we might not be alone in our surveillance of the skies. Sometimes, during the quiet hours before dawn, I catch myself wondering if they're still out there, watching our aircraft as carefully as we watch theirs. The thought is both terrifying and strangely comforting, that in the vast emptiness of space, something is paying attention to our small corner of the universe. The official report listed the incident as unexplained radar interference, but those of us who witnessed it know the truth. Something intelligent is sharing our skies, observing our movements with the same careful attention we give to tracking aircraft. And perhaps most remarkably, it tried to communicate with us, using our own technology to bridge the gap between our worlds. I still monitor those screens every night, watching for signs that our mysterious visitor has returned. Because somewhere out there, beyond the reach of our most powerful telescopes, something is watching back. And maybe, just maybe, it's trying to tell us that we're not alone in the darkness of space. The stars have never looked the same since that night. Each point of light now carries the possibility of intelligence, of beings who traverse the cosmos with the same curiosity that drives us to explore our own small world. And in the quiet moments between radio calls and flight updates, I find myself hoping that whatever was watching us that night continues to do so, that our presence in this universe has been noted and remembered by minds far greater than our own. Part 7. The facility was supposed to be routine surveillance, nothing more than a standard assignment monitoring atmospheric disturbances in the Nevada desert. I'd been stationed there for 3 months, working the overnight shift in a concrete bunker that felt more like a tomb than a research station. The isolation was complete. No cell service, no visitors, just me and the endless hum of equipment tracking weather patterns and electromagnetic anomalies. That changed the night I intercepted the transmission. It was 2:47 a.m. when the radio crackled to life with something that wasn't weather data. The voice was clear, speaking in perfect English, but the words made my blood run cold. Ground Station 7, this is Reconnaissance Unit 4. The subjects are ready for collection. Repeat, the subjects are ready for collection. I froze, fingers hovering over the controls. This wasn't supposed to happen. Our station monitored environmental data, not military communications. I checked the frequency. It was coming through on a channel that shouldn't have existed, one that wasn't on any of our official logs. Copy that. Reconnaissance 4, came the reply. Collection team is en route to coordinates 37.4 north, 115.8 west, ETA 12 minutes. Those coordinates were less than 5 miles from my location. I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside into the desert night. The air was still and cold, stars scattered across an endless black sky. To the west, I could see the faint glow of Las Vegas on the horizon, but everything else was darkness. Then I saw them. 3 lights moving in perfect formation, silent and deliberate. heading toward the coordinates I'd just heard. They weren't aircraft, at least not like any aircraft I'd ever seen. The lights moved too smoothly, too quietly, and they seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythm. As they passed overhead, I felt a strange pressure in my chest, like the air itself was vibrating. I rushed back inside and switched to the thermal imaging system. The screen showed 3 distinct heat signatures moving across the desert floor, but they weren't shaped like vehicles. They were elongated, almost organic, and they left no trail behind them. Whatever these things were, they defied every principle of physics I understood. The radio crackled again. Collection complete. 17 subjects secured. Returning to base. 17 subjects. The words echoed in my mind as I watched the thermal signatures disappear into the distance. What subjects? Who was being collected, and by whom? I tried to convince myself it was a military exercise, some classified operation I wasn't supposed to know about. But the way those lights moved, the way they seemed to bend reality around them, this wasn't human technology. Over the following weeks, I started paying closer attention to the radio transmissions. They came sporadically, always in the early morning hours, always using the same coded language: collection teams, reconnaissance units, subject transfers. Each time, I'd catch glimpses of those impossible lights moving across the desert, silent as ghosts. Then I found the files. I wasn't supposed to have access to the classified section of our database, but a glitch in the system gave me temporary clearance. What I discovered made me question everything I thought I knew about my assignment. Our facility wasn't just monitoring weather patterns. We were tracking something else entirely. The files contained decades of reports, going back to the 1950s. Incident reports, medical examinations, psychological evaluations, all centered around a single phenomenon: unexplained disappearances in the Nevada desert. People who vanished without a trace, leaving behind only strange electromagnetic signatures, and accounts from witnesses who claimed to have seen lights in the sky. But it wasn't just random disappearances. The files showed a pattern. A systematic collection of individuals who shared certain characteristics: enhanced cognitive abilities, unusual psychological profiles, genetic markers that appeared in less than 1% of the population. They were being taken for a reason. The most disturbing part was the medical reports. Some of the missing people had been found weeks or months later, returned to the exact spots where they'd disappeared. But they were changed. Memory gaps, unexplained surgical scars, foreign objects embedded in their tissue, objects that didn't match any known technology. I realized then that my job at the facility was never about monitoring the weather. I was documenting evidence of an ongoing operation, one that had been running for decades under the cover of atmospheric research. The government knew about the abductions. They were tracking them, cataloging them, possibly even facilitating them. That night, I made copies of everything I could access: names, dates, locations, medical reports. All of it went onto encrypted drives that I hid in my personal belongings. I knew I was taking an enormous risk, but people deserved to know the truth. 3 days later, I was reassigned. No explanation, no warning, just orders to pack my things and report to a new facility in Alaska. As I loaded my car, I noticed a black sedan parked across the road, its occupants watching me through tinted windows. They followed me for the first 50 miles before disappearing into traffic. I never made it to Alaska. Instead, I drove straight home and disappeared into civilian life. Carrying the weight of what I'd learned, the files I'd copied revealed the scope of something vast and terrifying, a collaboration between human authorities and entities that operated beyond our understanding. The abductions continued, I'm sure of that. The lights still move across the desert. collecting their subjects according to some alien agenda, and somewhere in a concrete bunker, another monitor sits at their station, documenting the evidence of humanity's darkest secret. I've kept quiet for years, telling myself that speaking out would only put me in danger. But the truth has a way of demanding to be told. People are being taken, studied, and returned like laboratory specimens. The government not only knows about it, they're complicit in it. Every time I see a missing person report from Nevada, I wonder if they've become another subject in the collection, another name in a file that will never see the light of day. The lights are still out there, moving through the darkness, and until someone with real power decides to stop them, the collection will continue. I know they're watching me. I can feel their presence sometimes, that same electromagnetic pressure I felt in the desert. They know I have the files, know I understand their operation. But maybe that's why I need to tell this story now, while I still can. The truth about what's happening in the Nevada desert needs to be told. People are disappearing, and it's not random, it's systematic, it's ongoing, and those in power are letting it happen. The lights in the sky aren't visitors, they're harvesters, and we're the crop. I was working late at the observatory, something I'd done countless times before. The night was clear, perfect for observations, and I had the whole facility to myself. Around 2:30 a.m., I noticed something unusual on the radar display. At first, I thought it was equipment malfunction, but the readings were too consistent, too deliberate. There was an object moving across our airspace, but not like anything I'd ever tracked. It wasn't following normal flight patterns, and it didn't match any known aircraft signatures. The object would appear on radar, hold position for exactly 37 seconds, then vanish completely. No gradual fade, no drift off screen, just gone. I tried contacting air traffic control, but my communications were down. The phones, the radio, even my cell phone showed no signal. That's when I realized the silence outside wasn't normal either. No insects, no wind, nothing. The entire world seemed to have gone quiet. Through the observatory's main telescope, I caught a glimpse of it. The object wasn't solid in any conventional sense. It appeared to shift and ripple, like looking at something underwater. Its surface reflected the starlight in patterns that hurt to focus on, geometric shapes that seemed to fold in on themselves. I started recording everything, but when I checked the footage later, the timestamps showed gaps, minutes of missing time that I couldn't account for. During those gaps, I found notes in my handwriting that I didn't remember making. Coordinates, sketches of symbols I'd never seen before, calculations in a notation system I didn't recognize. The most disturbing part was a message I'd apparently written to myself. They're not studying the stars, they're studying us studying the stars. When dawn broke, everything returned to normal. The communications came back online, the radar showed clear skies, and the natural sounds of morning filled the air. But I found something that convinced me the experience was real. On the observation deck, arranged in a perfect spiral, were 37 small metallic objects. They weren't hot or cold to the touch, just room temperature, and they hummed softly when held. I never reported the incident officially. Who would believe an astronomer claiming to see unidentified objects? But I kept those metallic pieces, and sometimes, late at night when I'm alone at the observatory, they begin to glow faintly and point toward the same section of sky where the object appeared. I've learned to recognize the signs now. When the communications cut out and the world goes silent, I know they're coming back. And each time I find myself writing down more of those strange symbols, as if some part of me understands what they mean, even though my conscious mind doesn't. The last message I found in my handwriting was different from the others. Instead of coordinates or symbols, it simply said, The invitation has been extended. The choice is yours. I still don't know what choice they're referring to, but I have a feeling that one night, when that familiar silence falls and the communications go dark, I'll find out. I was a security guard at a remote research facility deep in the mountains, the kind of place that doesn't appear on any maps and requires 3 different checkpoints just to reach the main gate. It was a government contract, high clearance, and they paid well enough that nobody asked too many questions about what went on inside those concrete walls. Most nights were routine, just walking the perimeter and checking monitors, but there was always this underlying tension, like the facility itself was holding its breath. The compound was divided into sections, each requiring different security levels. I had access to the outer rings and some of the administrative areas, but the central complex remained off-limits, sealed behind reinforced doors that required biometric scans I didn't possess. The researchers who worked there were polite but distant, arriving and leaving in unmarked vehicles, never speaking about their work. After 6 months on the job, I'd learned not to be curious about the classified projects happening beyond my clearance level. Everything changed on a Tuesday night in late October. I was making my usual rounds when the emergency lighting system activated throughout the facility, bathing everything in a harsh red glow. The main power hadn't failed, but something had triggered the backup protocols. My radio crackled with static before falling silent completely. The silence was more unsettling than any alarm would have been. I headed toward the central monitoring station to check the system status, but found the control room empty. The night supervisor, Dr. Martinez, was nowhere to be found, and her coffee cup was still warm on the desk. The security monitors showed nothing unusual in the outer sections, but the feeds from the restricted areas had gone dark. According to the computer logs, all systems were functioning normally, yet the emergency lighting continued to pulse in its steady, ominous rhythm. That's when I heard it. A low humming sound that seemed to come from deep within the facility. It wasn't mechanical like the generators or air conditioning systems I was familiar with. This sound had an organic quality, almost musical, and it seemed to resonate through the concrete floors and walls. The frequency was just low enough to feel in my chest rather than hear with my ears, creating a vibration that made my teeth ache. I tried calling the main security office, but the phones were dead. My cell phone showed no signal, which wasn't unusual given our remote location, but even the facility's internal communication systems had failed. The emergency protocols called for me to remain at my post and wait for backup, but something about the situation felt wrong. The humming was getting stronger, and I could swear I felt the building itself responding to whatever was generating that sound. Against my better judgment, I decided to investigate. Using my limited access cards, I ventured deeper into the facility than I'd ever gone before. The corridors were empty, emergency lighting casting long shadows that seemed to move independently of my flashlight beam. The humming grew louder as I approached the restricted sections, and I began to notice that the air itself felt different, thicker somehow, as if charged with static electricity. At the entrance to the central complex, I found the heavy security doors standing wide open. This should have been impossible without proper authorization, yet there they were, revealing a corridor that stretched into darkness beyond my flashlight's reach. The humming was strongest here, emanating from somewhere deep within the restricted area. Every instinct told me to turn back, but I was the only security personnel on duty, and people might be in danger. The corridor led to a large chamber I'd never known existed. The room was circular, with walls lined with strange equipment that didn't match any technology I recognized. In the center stood a cylindrical structure about the size of a telephone booth, made of what appeared to be a dark, metallic material that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The humming was coming from this device, and the air around it shimmered like heat waves rising from summer asphalt. As I watched, the surface of the cylinder began to change, becoming translucent, then transparent. Inside, I could see a figure, humanoid, but clearly not human. It was tall and thin, with elongated limbs and skin that had a pale, almost luminescent quality. Its eyes were large and dark, and when they focused on me, I felt a presence in my mind, not threatening but curious, as if it was trying to understand what I was. The being didn't speak, but somehow I understood that it had been contained here, studied, and that tonight it had found a way to communicate with the facility's systems. The emergency lighting, the communication failures, even the open doors, all of it had been orchestrated to create this moment. It wasn't trying to escape, it was trying to make contact, to bridge the gap between its intelligence and ours. I don't know how long I stood there, locked in that silent exchange. The being showed me images, flashes of understanding about its origins, its purpose, and why it had allowed itself to be captured. It wasn't alone, there were others, watching, waiting, trying to determine if humanity was ready for contact. This facility was just one of many sites around the world where they were conducting their own research on us, learning our languages, our customs, our capacity for understanding. The communication ended as abruptly as it had begun. The cylinder became opaque again, the humming stopped, and the emergency lighting returned to normal. I heard voices in the distance, the night shift personnel returning from whatever had drawn them away. I backed out of the chamber quickly, making my way through the corridors as the facility returned to its normal operations. By the time I reached my post, Dr. Martinez was back at her desk, acting as if nothing had happened. The next morning, I filed a routine incident report about the emergency lighting malfunction. No one mentioned the communication failures or the open security doors. It was as if the entire episode had been erased from the facility's memory, leaving only my own recollection as proof that it had occurred. I continued working there for another 3 months, but the routine had changed. I was no longer just a security guard. I was a witness to something far larger than I had imagined. I eventually transferred to a different position, but I never forgot what I experienced that night. Sometimes I wonder if the being knew I would remember, if that was part of the plan. The idea that we're being studied, evaluated, prepared for something bigger has stayed with me. When I look up at the night sky now, I don't see empty space filled with distant stars. I see a vast network of intelligence, watching, waiting, slowly making contact with a species that may finally be ready to join something far greater than itself. The facility still operates, hidden in those remote mountains, conducting research that will never appear in any public record. But I know the truth about what happens there, about the delicate dance of first contact that's been taking place in secret for longer than any of us realize. The beings aren't invaders or conquerors, they're teachers, and the lessons they're offering will change everything we think we know about our place in the universe. The call came in just after 3 a.m. on what should have been a routine night shift. I'd been working as a paramedic for nearly 15 years, seen everything from heart attacks to overdoses to car crashes that still wake me up sometimes, but nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened that October night. The dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio with coordinates to a rural farmhouse about 20 miles outside town. Possible unconsciousness, unresponsive male, caller hung up before providing details. Standard stuff, except for the address. I knew that stretch of road, knew it was mostly empty fields and the occasional farmstead scattered between long stretches of nothing. My partner Jake was new, maybe 6 months on the job, still had that eager energy that comes before you've seen too much. He was chattering about some football game as we drove through the darkness, our headlights cutting through the October fog that had rolled in thick from the river valley. I was only half listening. focused on the road ahead and the strange feeling settling in my chest like a weight. The farmhouse sat back from the road, connected by a gravel driveway that crunched under our tires as we pulled up. The place looked old, probably built in the 50s, with white clapboard siding and a wraparound porch that had seen better days. What struck me first was how dark it was. No porch light, no glow from any windows, just our ambulance headlights illuminating the front of the house in harsh white relief. Jake grabbed the medical bag while I shouldered the oxygen kit. The front door stood slightly ajar, which wasn't unusual for medical calls. Families often left doors open when they were expecting us. But as we approached, I noticed something that made me pause. The door wasn't just open, it was hanging crooked on its hinges, like it had been forced. "Hello?" I called out, pushing the door wider. "Paramedics." No response. The house was silent in that heavy way that makes your ears ring. Jake was behind me, flashlight cutting through the darkness inside. The beam revealed a living room that looked normal enough. Couch and coffee table, family photos on the mantel. But there was this smell in the air, not decay or gas or anything I could identify, more like the metallic taste you get in your mouth before a thunderstorm. We found him in the kitchen, lying on the linoleum floor in front of the refrigerator. Middle-aged man, maybe 50, wearing pajamas and a bathrobe. At first glance, it looked like a standard medical emergency, maybe a heart attack or stroke. But as I knelt beside him and Jake set up our equipment, I started noticing things that didn't add up. His skin was pale, almost gray, but there was no cyanosis around the lips or fingernails that you'd expect with cardiac arrest. His breathing was shallow but steady, pupils responsive to light. But when I tried to rouse him, he didn't react at all. It was like he was caught somewhere between consciousness and coma, aware enough to maintain basic functions but completely unreachable. "What do you think?" Jake asked, checking vitals. "Blood pressure's normal, pulse is steady but slow, temp is low, but not dangerously so." I was running through possibilities in my head when I noticed his hands. Both palms were facing up, and there were these small circular marks on each palm, about the size of a quarter. They weren't burns or cuts, more like perfect indentations pressed into the skin. The edges were slightly raised, as if the flesh had been molded around something. "Jake, look at this." He leaned over, and his flashlight illuminated the marks clearly. They were too precise to be accidental, too uniform to be natural. And there was something else, a faint pattern within each circle, like tiny geometric shapes pressed into the skin. "What the hell made those?" Jake whispered. Before I could answer, we heard it. A low, humming sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It wasn't mechanical, wasn't electrical, it was something else entirely. The kitchen windows started to vibrate slightly, and I felt that metallic taste intensify in my mouth. Jake's equipment started acting up. The heart monitor flickered, showing erratic readings that didn't match what we were seeing. His blood pressure cuff inflated and deflated on its own, and the oxygen saturation meter couldn't get a stable reading. "We need to get him out of here," I said. But my voice sounded strange, like I was speaking underwater. That's when the man's eyes opened. Not slowly, not the gradual awakening you'd expect from someone regaining consciousness, but all at once, like someone had flipped a switch. His pupils were dilated, completely black, and he was staring straight up at the ceiling with an intensity that made my skin crawl. His mouth moved, forming words, but no sound came out at first. Then, barely audible, he began to speak. But it wasn't English, wasn't any language I'd ever heard. The syllables were too precise, too rhythmic, like he was reciting something from memory. Jake had gone completely still beside me. The humming was getting louder now, and I could feel it in my bones, a vibration that seemed to resonate with something deep inside my chest. The man's lips kept moving, forming those strange words, and his hands with those circular marks began to twitch. I'd seen seizures before, seen people in altered states from drugs or head trauma, but this was different. This felt deliberate, like he was trying to communicate something urgent. The marks on his palms started to glow faintly. Not bright, just a soft phosphorescence that pulsed in time with his words. "We need to go," I said to Jake, but he wasn't listening. He was staring at the man's hands, transfixed by that soft glow. The kitchen lights flickered once, twice, then went out completely. Our flashlights dimmed, the beams becoming weak and yellow. In the darkness, those marks on the man's palms were the only source of light, pulsing steadily like a heartbeat. I grabbed Jake's arm and shook him. "Jake, we need to move him now." He blinked, seeming to come back to himself, and together we lifted the man onto our gurney. He didn't resist, didn't even seem to notice we were moving him. His eyes remained fixed on something above us, and his lips continued forming those strange words. Getting him to the ambulance felt like wading through thick water. Every step was an effort, and the humming followed us, growing stronger as we emerged from the house. The fog had thickened, and our ambulance looked like it was floating in a sea of white. As we loaded the gurney, I caught a glimpse of something in my peripheral vision. Shapes moving in the fog, tall and thin, just at the edge of visibility. I turned to look directly, but there was nothing there, just the swirling mist and the feeling of being watched. Jake started the engine, and we pulled away from the farmhouse. In the back, I tried to establish an IV line, but the man's veins seemed to disappear under my touch. The marks on his palms had stopped glowing, and his strange recitation had ceased. He lay still and silent, breathing steadily, but his eyes remained wide open and focused on something I couldn't see. The drive to the hospital should have taken 20 minutes. We'd made the trip hundreds of times, knew every curve and straightaway, but that night the road seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of us. Jake kept checking the GPS, muttering about the route being wrong, but the familiar landmarks were all there, just spaced impossibly far apart. "How long have we been driving?" he asked, after what felt like an hour. I checked my watch. According to the digital display, only 10 minutes had passed since we'd left the farmhouse, but it felt like we'd been on the road for much longer, like time itself was stretching and compressing around us. The man in the back remained motionless, but I could feel something changing. The air in the ambulance was getting thicker, and that metallic taste was back stronger than ever. My equipment bag felt heavier, and when I tried to take the man's pulse, my fingers felt clumsy and unresponsive. Then, without any warning, he sat up. Not the gradual rise of someone regaining consciousness, but a sudden mechanical movement like a puppet being jerked upright. His black eyes fixed on mine, and for the first time since we'd found him, he spoke in English. "They're coming back for me." His voice was hollow, emotionless, like he was reading from a script. "They're not finished yet." I tried to keep my voice steady. "Who's coming back? Who did this to you?" He tilted his head, studying me with those dilated pupils. "You saw them in the fog. They let you see them." I had seen them, those tall shapes moving just beyond clear vision. But I told myself it was imagination, stress, the strange circumstances playing tricks on my mind. "What did they want?" I asked. "To show me things, to make me understand." He held up his hands, palms facing me. The circular marks were clearly visible, no longer glowing but still perfectly formed. "They put pictures in my head, pictures of what's coming." The ambulance suddenly jerked to a stop. Jake called back from the driver's seat, his voice tight with confusion. The road's gone. I looked out the back windows. We were surrounded by fog so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. No road, no trees, no landmarks of any kind. Just white emptiness stretching away on all sides. The man smiled, and it was the most unsettling thing I'd ever seen. "They're here." The humming returned, louder than before, so intense it made my teeth ache. The ambulance began to vibrate, gently at first, then more violently. Jake was calling out something from the front, but his voice sounded distant and distorted. Through the fog, lights appeared. Not the harsh white of headlights or the warm yellow of street lamps, but something softer, more diffuse. They moved in formation, circling us slowly, and as they drew closer I could make out shapes within the light. They were tall, just as I'd glimpsed in the fog at the farmhouse, but now I could see them clearly. Elongated limbs, smooth faces without features I could identify, moving with a fluid grace that seemed to defy gravity. They approached the ambulance with purpose, their forms becoming more solid as they emerged from the mist. The man on the gurney was watching me, his smile never wavering. "They want to show you too. The pictures. The understanding." One of the beings reached the back doors of the ambulance. I couldn't see how it opened them. There was no sound of latches or hinges. But suddenly the doors were wide and the fog was pouring in. The being stood in the opening, and though I couldn't make out distinct facial features, I felt its attention focused entirely on me. Images flooded my mind. Not pictures exactly, but impressions, concepts, understandings that my brain struggled to process. Cities of light stretching across landscapes I didn't recognize. Skies filled with vessels that moved like living things, and Earth seen from above, but changed, different, covered in structures that pulsed with the same soft glow I'd seen on the man's palms. The being stepped into the ambulance, and I felt a pressure in my head, gentle but insistent. It wasn't painful, but it was overwhelming, like trying to hold too much information at once. I understood that they weren't invaders or conquerors, but something else entirely. Teachers, maybe, or guides, showing us glimpses of what we might become. The man on the gurney sat up further, swinging his legs over the side. "Now you know," he said. "Now you've seen." The being touched my forehead with what might have been a hand, and the pressure intensified. More images, more understanding. They'd been here before, many times, selecting individuals to receive these visions. The man with the marks was one of many, chosen to carry the knowledge forward, to plant seeds of awareness in minds that might be ready to accept them. But there was something else in those images, something darker, a sense of urgency, of time running short. Whatever they were trying to prepare us for, it was coming soon. The being withdrew its touch, and the overwhelming flow of information ceased. I was left gasping, my mind reeling from what I'd experienced. The fog began to clear, and gradually I could see the familiar shapes of trees and road signs emerging from the white. The man stood up from the gurney, perfectly steady on his feet. The marks on his palms had faded to faint scars, but his eyes remained that deep, dilated black. "You'll remember," he said. "When the time comes, you'll remember what you've seen." He walked to the open doors where the being waited. Without looking back, he stepped out into the dissipating fog. The being followed, and both figures disappeared into the mist as if they'd never been there at all. Jake called back from the driver's seat, his voice normal again. "Hey, we're moving again. ETA 5 minutes to the hospital." I looked at my watch. Somehow, despite everything that had happened, only 15 minutes had passed since we'd left the farmhouse. The gurney was empty, straps still in place as if no one had been lying there. My equipment showed no signs of the earlier malfunctions. "Jake," I called forward. "What happened to the patient?" There was a pause. "What patient?" "Dispatch canceled that call 20 minutes ago. Said it was a false alarm." I checked our log. No record of a pickup, no patient information, no call to the farmhouse. According to every official record, we'd spent the night on routine patrol, responding to nothing more significant than a minor fender bender downtown. But I remembered everything. The man with the marks, the beings in the fog, the images they'd shown me. And sometimes, late at night when I'm trying to sleep, I can still feel that gentle pressure in my head, and I see those visions of light-filled cities and transformed skies. I never told Jake what I remembered. When I asked him about that night, he looked at me with genuine confusion, insisting nothing unusual had happened. Maybe they'd taken those memories from him, or maybe I was the only one meant to carry them forward. I think about that man often. Wonder if he's out there somewhere, still bearing those marks, still carrying the knowledge they gave him. And I wonder about the others they've chosen, how many of us there are, walking around with these visions in our heads, waiting for the time when we'll understand what we're supposed to do with them. The images are getting clearer lately, more frequent. The sense of urgency is stronger too, like whatever they were preparing us for is almost here. I've started keeping a journal, writing down everything I can remember, trying to make sense of the patterns and symbols I saw in those brief moments of contact. I don't know if I'm going crazy or if I was chosen to witness something that will change everything. But I know one thing for certain. They're still out there in the fog and darkness, selecting people to receive their gift of terrible understanding. And someday soon, we're going to find out why. Part 11. Disturbing Real Alien Stories. We were conducting routine surveillance over international waters, something we'd done hundreds of times before. The mission briefing was standard. Monitor shipping lanes, track weather patterns, document any unusual activity. Nothing in the orders suggested this would be anything more than another 8-hour flight over empty ocean. But sometimes the most extraordinary encounters happen during the most ordinary moments. I was piloting the lead aircraft in a formation of 3 reconnaissance planes. We'd been airborne for about 4 hours, cruising at 35,000 feet through crystal-clear skies. The ocean below stretched endlessly in all directions, a vast expanse of deep blue broken only by the occasional white cap. My instruments showed normal readings across the board. Fuel levels were good, weather was stable, and radio communications with base were clear and consistent. That's when Lieutenant Morrison's voice crackled through my headset from the aircraft flying 200 meters off my starboard wing. His tone was measured, professional, but I could detect an underlying tension that made me pay attention immediately. "Flight leader, I'm seeing something unusual at 2 o'clock, approximately 10 miles out. Can you confirm visual contact?" And I banked slightly to get a better view of the area Morrison had indicated. At first, I saw nothing but the familiar monotony of ocean and sky. Then, just at the edge of my vision, I caught sight of what appeared to be a disturbance in the water. It wasn't a ship or a whale surfacing. The disturbance was too large, too uniform, and it was moving in a way that defied everything I knew about oceanography. "I have eyes on the anomaly," I radioed back. "Looks like a displacement pattern, but I can't identify the source. Rodriguez, are you picking this up on your instruments?" Rodriguez was flying the 3rd aircraft in our formation, equipped with the most advanced sensor array we had available. His response came back immediately, and his voice carried a note of confusion that was unusual for someone with his experience. "Affirmative, flight leader. I'm reading massive electromagnetic interference in that area. My equipment is showing something large beneath the surface, but the signature doesn't match anything in our database. Whatever it is, it's approximately 800 meters in length and rising rapidly. 800 meters. The implications of that measurement hit me immediately. Nothing that large should be able to move through water at the speed we were observing. The largest submarines ever built were less than 200 meters long, and they certainly couldn't generate the kind of disturbance we were witnessing. As we watched, the water began to churn more violently. Massive waves radiated outward from a central point, creating a perfect circle of turbulence that expanded steadily. The ocean itself seemed to be boiling, though we were too high to feel any thermal effects. Then, slowly, something began to emerge from the depths. The first thing I noticed was the light. It wasn't reflected sunlight or the glow of conventional illumination. This was something else entirely. A soft, pulsing radiance that seemed to emanate from the object itself. The light had an otherworldly quality, shifting through colors I'd never seen before. Hues that seemed to exist somewhere between blue and silver, green and gold. As more of the object broke the surface, its true scale became apparent. Rodriguez's estimate had been conservative. This thing was enormous, dwarfing anything humans had ever constructed. It rose from the water with impossible grace, defying the laws of physics that should have governed something of its size and apparent mass. The craft, for lack of a better term, was unlike anything in our military databases. Its surface appeared to be seamless, constructed from some kind of material that seemed to shift and flow like liquid metal while maintaining perfect structural integrity. There were no visible joints, no welding seams, no indication of how such a massive object could have been assembled. "Flight leader, my instruments are going haywire," Morrison reported. "Navigation systems are fluctuating, and I'm losing radio contact with base. Are you experiencing similar malfunctions?" I checked my own equipment and confirmed his assessment. Our most sophisticated military-grade electronics were failing systematically. Compass readings spun wildly, altimeters gave impossible readings, and our radio transmissions were being overwhelmed by some kind of interference that sounded almost musical in its complexity. The object continued its slow ascent until it was completely clear of the water. It hovered there, motionless, approximately 50 feet above the ocean surface. Water cascaded from its hull in perfect sheets, and I realized that despite its enormous size, the craft was generating no wake, no disturbance in the air around it. It simply existed in space as if the normal rules of aerodynamics didn't apply. Then it began to move toward us. The acceleration was instantaneous and impossible. One moment the craft was hovering above the water, the next it was alongside our formation, matching our speed and altitude with perfect precision. There was no visible propulsion system, no exhaust trails, no sound. It simply moved through space with the same effortless grace it had displayed rising from the ocean. "Orders, flight leader?" Rodriguez's voice was steady, but I could hear the tension underneath. We were all thinking the same thing. Our weapon systems, even if they were functioning properly, would be utterly inadequate against something of this size and apparent technological sophistication. Before I could respond, something extraordinary happened. The craft began to communicate. It wasn't radio transmission or any form of electronic signal. The communication came directly into our minds, bypassing our ears entirely. The sensation was unlike anything I'd ever experienced, like having thoughts that weren't your own, ideas that formed without the usual process of thinking. The message was complex, layered with meanings that went far beyond simple words. But the core concept was clear. They were observers, not invaders. They had been monitoring human activity for decades, studying our technological development, our social structures, our impact on the planet's ecosystem. This encounter was not accidental. We had been selected, Images flooded our consciousness. Vast underwater installations hidden in ocean trenches, monitoring stations disguised as natural formations, observation posts that had been recording human civilization for generations. We saw glimpses of technology so advanced it might as well have been magic. Energy sources that could power entire continents, transportation methods that made our fastest aircraft seem primitive. But with the wonder came a warning. The images shifted to show environmental destruction on a scale that was difficult to comprehend. Climate systems collapsing, oceans rising, massive population centers underwater. They weren't threats or promises of intervention. They were simply observations, data points in a long-term study of planetary development. The communication lasted perhaps 10 minutes, though time seemed distorted during the exchange. When it ended, the craft began to descend back toward the ocean. Its movement was as smooth and impossible as its initial ascent, defying every principle of physics we understood. Just before it disappeared beneath the surface, one final message reached us. It was simpler than the complex data exchange we'd experienced, but somehow more profound. They would continue watching. Humanity's choices in the coming decades would determine whether future contact would be as peaceful as this encounter. The moment the craft submerged, our instruments returned to normal. Radio contact with base was restored, navigation system stabilized, and all our equipment functioned as if nothing had happened. But the three of us knew that everything had changed. The debriefing was extensive and classified at the highest levels. Our flight records were confiscated, our equipment was analyzed for anomalies, and we were subjected to psychological evaluations that lasted for weeks. The official report classified the incident as unexplained atmospheric phenomena with possible equipment malfunction. But I know what we experienced was real. The knowledge they shared, the technology they displayed, the implications for our understanding of life in the universe, all of it was genuine. We had been given a glimpse into a reality far larger and more complex than anything we had imagined. Sometimes I wonder why they revealed themselves to us. Were we simply in the right place at the right time? Or was there something more deliberate about the encounter? The message suggested they had been choosing when and how to make contact, carefully selecting individuals who could handle the knowledge without causing widespread panic. What troubles me most is the warning they shared. The environmental data, the projections of planetary collapse, the timeline they suggested for critical decision points in human development. If their observations are accurate, we have very little time to address the challenges they identified. I've never spoken publicly about what happened that day. The classification levels ensure that official acknowledgement is impossible, and the consequences for unauthorized disclosure would be severe. But the knowledge weighs on me constantly. Somewhere beneath our oceans, representatives of a civilization far more advanced than ours are watching, evaluating, and perhaps preparing for a future that depends entirely on choices we haven't even realized we need to make. The most unsettling aspect of the entire experience was the sense that this encounter was just the beginning. They had revealed themselves for a reason, shared information for a purpose. Whatever comes next, humanity's response to the challenges they highlighted will determine whether future contact brings knowledge and assistance, or simply more distant observation of a species that failed to evolve beyond its destructive impulses. Every time I look up at the night sky or out over the ocean, I remember that we are not alone. The universe is filled with intelligence far beyond our current understanding, and we are being watched by minds that have been studying us far longer than we have been aware of their existence. The question that haunts me is whether we will prove worthy of the knowledge they possess, or whether we will join the countless other civilizations they have undoubtedly observed throughout their long history of exploration and discovery. Part 12. The Final Message. These encounters share a common thread that runs deeper than simple observation or chance meetings. Throughout each account, we see evidence of intelligence beyond our comprehension. Beings who possess technology that defies our understanding of physics and reality. Yet in almost every case, these entities seem driven not by conquest or domination, but by something far more profound. A desperate need to communicate, to warn, and perhaps to save us from ourselves. The pilot who encountered the musical tones in the sky, the cancer patient who refused the alien bargain, the mother who became a bridge between worlds, the archaeologist who uncovered an ancient treaty we've apparently broken, the researchers in Antarctica who awakened something that had been sleeping in the ice for millennia. Each story reveals fragments of a larger truth. We are not alone, and we never have been. These beings have been here, watching, waiting, trying to reach us in ways we can barely comprehend. What's perhaps most unsettling is the pattern of time distortions, missing memories, and technological failures that accompany these encounters. Cameras malfunction, GPS systems fail, phones lose signal, and witnesses find themselves unable to prove what they've experienced. It's as if these beings exist slightly outside our reality, able to step in and out of our world at will, leaving behind only fragments of evidence and minds forever changed by the encounter. The recurring theme of warnings cannot be ignored. From the hiker who heard "something is coming" to the treaty that speaks of a broken balance, from the lights that seemed to be searching for help to the entities that showed visions of Earth's possible future, these accounts suggest that whatever these beings are, they're trying to tell us something urgent. The question is whether we're listening, or whether we're even capable of understanding the message they're trying to convey. Some witnesses speak of feeling chosen, selected for reasons they cannot fathom. The influencer whose dreams connected her to a cosmic network. The single mother who became a host for alien consciousness. The pilot who found himself able to communicate through simple flares of light. These accounts suggest that contact isn't random but purposeful, that these beings are carefully selecting individuals who might serve as bridges between our worlds. Perhaps most chilling are the stories that hint at ongoing programs of study and collection. The security guard who watched shape-shifting figures move through his building. The military personnel who witnessed crashes and retrievals. The researchers who uncovered evidence of long-term observation and experimentation. These accounts paint a picture of a planet under careful scrutiny, with its inhabitants being catalogued, studied, and perhaps prepared for something we cannot yet imagine. The time has come to acknowledge what these witnesses have been trying to tell us. We are part of something much larger than ourselves, participants in a cosmic drama that has been unfolding for millennia. Whether these beings come as friends, observers, or harbingers of change, their presence in our world appears to be intensifying. The veil between our reality and theirs grows thinner with each passing day. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember that the universe is vast and full of wonders beyond our current understanding. These stories remind us that reality is far stranger and more magnificent than we dare to imagine. In the quiet darkness, in the spaces between sleeping and waking, perhaps you too will catch a glimpse of the greater truth that surrounds us all. The encounters continue. The witnesses speak their truth. And somewhere in the vast expanse of space and time, other intelligences watch and wait, hoping that one day we will finally understand the message they've been trying so desperately to share. Until then, we can only listen, learn, and remain open to the possibility that we are not the only conscious beings calling this universe home. As we reach the end of these extraordinary accounts, one thing becomes undeniably clear. We are not alone, and we never have been. Each story we've explored tonight reveals a pattern that's both fascinating and deeply unsettling. These beings, whatever their true nature or origin, appear to be conducting a careful, methodical study of humanity. They're collecting our memories, our DNA, our very essence, piece by piece, encounter by encounter. The witnesses in these stories weren't seeking fame or attention. They were ordinary people living ordinary lives until something extraordinary found them. A truck driver on a lonely highway, a construction worker in the pre-dawn darkness, a forest ranger protecting our wilderness, a security guard doing his rounds, military personnel sworn to secrecy. Their diverse backgrounds and locations suggest these encounters are happening everywhere, to everyone, more often than we dare to imagine. What's most disturbing isn't the advanced technology or the strange beings themselves, but the consistent message they seem to be conveying. Time is running out. Environmental collapse, spiritual awakening, cosmic truths we're not ready to comprehend. Are they warning us, preparing us, or simply documenting our species before it's too late? As you close your eyes tonight, remember that somewhere above us, beyond our atmosphere, intelligences far older and wiser than ourselves are watching, waiting, and perhaps deciding our fate. The question isn't whether contact will happen, but whether we'll be ready when it does. Sweet dreams, and remember they might be watching you too,